Hello, boys and girls. Before we start today's episode, I'd like to give a special shout out to Kalo from Psycho Films for being our first ever interviewee here on Pop Culture Everything and for dropping some hot, juicy exclusives that you can check out. Link in description. And I'd also like to give an additional shout out to everybody that watched the entire podcast from start to finish. Y'all are extremely, extremely sexy. And I'm very pleased to introduce one of those sexy people right here. Ladies and gentlemen, please give it up for my friend, and as of today, the new co-host of Pop Culture Everything, Emil.
Yo, what's up, guys? I'm Emil. You may know me from the first podcast. I like long walks on the beach, bikes, the non-motorized kind, fountain pens, and bad openings. Let me tell you, This opening took a solid hour to record, and I'm pretty sure there's going to be plenty of parts that had to be edited out. I have no idea what's up with us right now, but that took way too long. You know what else I love, Kareem? Bad segues. Speaking of bad segues, I like to think we're both tech enthusiasts, but I'm kind of curious what your history with tech is. Is it something that like you grew up on, or is it something that like you've only recently discovered as a hidden passion of yours?
Wow. Thank you not only for the roast, the introduction to yourself, but also for pointing out how bad we are at just speaking like normal people. Seriously, like, I don't know what the hell is wrong with us, but we might not be literate with people or with introducing ourselves, but we are literate with tech. See, that's how you do a segue.
Yeah,
that's how you do a segue. Don't worry, man. I got you. I give a little kiss on the cheek right there. So, Emil, I'm very happy that we're finally doing this. I've wanted to get you just one-on-one for a while for one simple reason. And do you know what it is? Emil, you're the only other friend I have that, besides me, I consider myself my own friend. You're the only other friend I have that likes technology, but not in like, oh yeah, I use it. You know, I flirt with the occasional computer, but like, I can tell you how this motherboard works, kind of like enthusiast. So like, I need to get your opinion on something that I've always wondered. Emil, do you watch any of the big guys? And the reason this is an important question is because, like, I know one-to-one, all you do is just, like, go hard about, like, who the big YouTubers are and why you don't watch them. So I have to ask, and I'm sure everybody else is going to be wondering, why do you not watch the big guys? Why do you watch these, like, niche YouTubers with, like, 200,000 subscribers that are, like, speaking in only monotone about computer arrangements? Like, why like, is it just like exhilarating for you, or is it like you don't like editing?
It's not that I necessarily hate the big YouTubers. I mean, if we're talking about exclusively tech here, the reason I like to watch smaller niche tech tubers, as I like to call them, is mostly just down to the content that they produce. Now, just for a bit of context with like my history with computers is that I have a brother who's big into tech, and he went to college for computer science back in like the early 2000s, and so he kind of introduced me to like programming, all the parts of the computer. In fact, I helped build my first computer in the early 2010s, and I was in like middle school at around the time, so I have a long, extensive history with this stuff. And my problem with a lot of the bigger tech tubers, not that like this is a problem per se, it's just more like why I don't watch them. It's because a lot of them are more they're more about reviewing products, and the tech side of it is just more of a category, and they don't get very technical. The most technical they get is just kind of listing the specs behind it, which I would say is about as far as it goes. And I like to watch the more niche channels because they do go into the more technical stuff. Like, one of the channels I love to watch is Code Bullet, and his content, I mean, I wouldn't call him small. I don't know exactly how many subs he has, but the content he usually produces is related to AI. So one of the videos I love to watch from I watched from him was about Minesweeper, and essentially what he did was he created kind of this pseudo artificial intelligence that solved Minesweeper like instantly, and it like beat the world record at the time. And like that's the kind of interesting stuff I like to watch. I'm more into the software end than the hardware end, and just kind of seeing the more technical like, oh, how do you write a program that does this is what interests me more, especially as a former computer science student, than, oh, hey, check out the new latest phone. Another channel I like to watch is Luke Smith. He, funny enough, he actually hates computers. In fact, he's a linguist, but for
What?
some reason he's really into Arch Linux, which is like one of the more technical distributions of Linux, and it's not like Gen 2 or like Linux from scratch where like you build it yourself, but it is definitely like hard to install and hard to manage if you don't know what you're doing or if you don't know how a computer works. And it's just funny watching his videos as a guy who hates computers but does everything he can to optimize them in the most technical way possible. So that those are the kind of channels I like to watch. But funny enough, from the bigger channels, I think that includes like Marcus Brownlee, Austin Evans, Linus Tech Tips. I like Linus Tech Tips the most because I think he's he seems at the very least the most technologically literate out of all of them. Not to say that the rest of them aren't. It's just he gets a lot more technical into his kind of like description of products. And I actually like watching Tech Quickie because he actually talks about what each part of the computer does, and he also talks about the software side, like how programs allocate memory and like how that affects your computer. And like I like watching that channel because it does talk about each part, and I do watch some of his videos on occasion. I just don't watch all of them because not everything appeals to me, but that's generally why I avoid the larger YouTubers. It's just more like preference. I'll watch them if I want to specifically buy a product, but I'll also watch a lot of other channels, so it's not like I'm exclusively watching them. But like that's generally why.
All right. So here's my whole thing, right? I'm compared to you, I'm very like illiterate when it comes to computers because I started this whole like tech enthusiast journey I think back in October when I was looking for laptops or something about smartphones. I remember it was something along those lines, and I was just like scrolling through trying to figure out what was what, and I can't remember the exact YouTuber. It was one of the big guys, definitely. I can't remember if it was Marquez or Linus, but they just, oh man, they started my like spiral, my like downward spiral into the tech YouTuber hole. And I think right now, cumulatively, I've watched 600 hours worth of tech YouTuber content. So that includes like anything from phone reviews to laptop reviews to like gaming rigs, just anything that involves tech. And I think the way I did it was I tried to break it down by tech accessory. So I started with headphones, worked my way up to like peripherals. So like understanding what like different key switches were in a keyboard. Then I moved up, like way up into like computer, like desktop internals. Then I kind of downscaled a little bit back to laptops. And then I went up again to like monitors and stuff because that was really what I didn't understand. And right now I can probably tell you, I can identify 85 to 90% of what's inside of a computer, but I don't know if I can troubleshoot any problem like I could have. So, for example, I can't really diagnose a
Hey,
motherboard,
can I
as you
interrupt?
know.
What's the 10% you don't know?
So the 10% I don't know is what like cache is. I don't know what um oh, okay. I don't know what this stupid, and I was going to get to this. I don't know what this stupid red light is on my motherboard that will not go away. That just randomly appeared and it's been on there for 3-4 months and I have no idea like I'm kind of scared that one day my computer's just going
Before
to
anyone
fucking
writes in the
explode.
comments, yes, I've suggested he check the manual. His motherboard is so old that there is no manual for it.
Okay, that's not okay. Like, whoa, hold on. Like, let's not go crazy here. So that's not the case. So I bought my desktop for about $750, which is a great deal because I got a 1060. I got 16 gigabytes of RAM, a DDR3, I think it was. Yeah, definitely DDR3 because my motherboard cannot like handle DDR4. I got a Core i7. I don't remember the exact series, and I got a 2 terabyte hard drive. So I got a pretty decent build for a really good price. Like I got a lot of value from my stuff, right? And I didn't look at the spec sheet because fundamentally, and I'm kind of embarrassed to say this, like I bought the computer so I can have the chance to upgrade it periodically, right? But I bought it with the intent to upgrade like the RAM or like the hard drive or like maybe the CPU if I was feeling a little bit more adventurous. The last thing I would ever want to upgrade is the motherboard because that amount of technical skill is so above my pay grade that I'm just like not ready for that kind of thing. Also, I'm not emotionally ready to spend money on a motherboard. Like I'm really not there yet emotionally. Like you know what I
I
mean?
have
Like I
no
haven't
idea
made
what
my
you mean
peace with it.
because like it's funny because the motherboard is both the most important part of your computer but the least impactful because what your motherboard essentially does is just like it does a bit more, but essentially what it does is just communicate with like the rest of your computer. So usually if like you have a blinking light, you usually check the manual because it's rarely ever a problem with the motherboard and it's more a problem with the other parts in your computer.
See, that's the thing. I'm 95% sure that it is, but I cannot for the life of me figure out what it is. And I know this is where everybody's going to be like, "Well, what about the manual?" So, I looked up my motherboard model, I googled the manual, and I downloaded the PDF, and I found out something very interesting. So the gentleman who put together this little build of mine was able to get the price so cheap. I hate using that. Like so like budget because he cut corners on the motherboard. So I have the motherboard from a Dell I think it's called Optiplex 360. If you don't know what those are like the computers that are used in like public schools. So what he did was he took one of those old motherboards and he just spec'd them out to the absolute limit of what they can handle. So that's why I have 16 gigabytes of DDR3 because that's the very limit of what the motherboard can take. I cannot upgrade the RAM on this motherboard. Uh, the 1060 I could probably upgrade to something higher, but that remains to be seen. I can't upgrade the CPU any higher than an i7. There's no way. I know for a fact that there's no way I can put an i9 in this motherboard. It will literally fry.
That honestly, that's amazing. To get off track a bit, actually, I find it funny you mentioned before how you said that you kind of started with accessories and then you moved on to so you went from headphones to mice to monitors. I'm curious, how does this relate to like your taste in the tech channels?
Okay, so I'd like to think I sampled everything to get a taste of what most like interested me. And for now, I think what's really catching my eye is the smartphone world because and I'll explain. Even though it's the least like technical, it is the most sexy. So, for example, like smartphones are the most commonly used piece of tech just period, right? Like there's no singular tech item that people have that is more used than their smartphone. So for me, it raises the question of not only the technical aspect of smartphones, because Lord knows that they're hitting kind of like a peak, and the chips specifically are like succumbing to the same failure of Moore's law as like computer CPUs. But we'll get to that later. The main like reason they're so exciting is because of the potential growth right now. So let me explain. I don't know if you noticed, like I don't know if you watched it, but the Samsung keynote from February when they introduced the Galaxy Fold, the world's first ever. It's not the first ever, but it's like the world's most the world's like first ever relevant smartphone. I say relevant, just like kind of like tongue in cheek. I mean, it's like from like a established big
Is the
manufacturer.
S10 not relevant?
Dude, the S10, don't you do that to me. Okay. The S series, okay. Oh my god, yeah, you hit a
Oh,
nerve.
that's
Oh
my
my
job.
God. Ooh. Okay, look. The S series is the most fucking garbage thing I've ever. Okay. Ooh, fuck! You really got me started. The S series is literally the most pointless phone line ever. No, actually, recently I want to revise that statement. It is the second most
After what?
pointless phone line ever. That proud title has just been overtaken by Huawei. So I don't know if you watch any of the big guys like the Unbox Therapies and the Marquez Brownlees of the world right now. Like right now, like when it comes like there's like a new phone cycle for 2019
Phones
starting
don't
with the
excite me.
S10.
Sorry there, bud.
Ugh, fucking nerd. Um, so the second phone, like the second flagship to be like released is Huawei's P30 Pro and P30 Lite. Sorry, not Lite, P30 regular. And let me tell you, the regular P30 to me is so infuriating because of what they did with it. So I kind of blame Apple for this a little bit, but I more blame Samsung. So I understand in theory why phone manufacturers make these like what did Marquez call them? Premium mid-range phones that are like in the $750 range that aren't necessarily flagships, like flagship like prices, but they're not even they're not close to budget,
Remember when
you know what I mean?
flagship phones used to be $600?
I know. And now like mid-range phones are like $500.
I mean, yeah.
It's that's really crazy. You know what it is? So this is just like a little segue, but the main thing that phone manufacturers are competing over these days, like the only thing that's left, because like I mentioned earlier, there's a plateau when it comes to chipsets, RAM, because there's only so much shit you can do with like an insane amount of RAM on a fucking smartphone. The S series, I'll give this for the S10. The coolest thing about it is if you get the top end, highest spec S10 Plus, you get the ability of a terabyte of storage, 512 locally, and then the ability to upgrade to a 512 SD card. That is a terabyte
That's
in your pocket.
wild
That is
because
amazing.
I think even up to like, even until like 2015, I think the standard was like you start with 16 gigs of not memory, of storage. And I remember I was thinking like, what am I going to use 64 gigs of storage for? And right now I have 128 gigs on my Note 9, and I'm thinking, some people buy a terabyte, but like, what are you gonna? Unless you're like downloading nothing but movies completely legally, like, what are you going to be using that much storage for?
Right, and it's like, but the option to have it is nice, and it really shows how far we've come. But on the flip side, it also shows a little negative because it means that Samsung and to some degree, like Apple and Huawei, like the big three, they're struggling to add features that attract people to buy the new phones. Because the only thing that that kind of leads me into my point. The only thing these phone manufacturers have left to bargain with to like even remotely convince somebody to buy a new flagship when their 1 year old insanely powerful Snapdragon 845 equipped smartphone like has like is perfectly fine, right? The only way they can convince you to buy the new one is by spending all their money on R&D for cameras. So that's the big trend right now. Cameras, cameras, cameras. With the Samsung Galaxy S10, you got 3 cameras. They added a super ultra wide camera as well as like the telephoto and primary like shooter. And for Huawei, they also added the super wide angle one. But and here's the but, the big
All right.
big thing. Are you ready? The P30 Pro, this total, it's like the plus version of like, if the P series is what the S series is to like Huawei is to Samsung, then the S10 Plus would be like the Pro right? The P30 Pro, and the like regular S10 or S10e would be the P30 like light. It's not light again. It's like the normal non-pro version, you know. Now, what they did specifically that made me furious, Huawei, was they removed one thing that was warranted to get it down to a cheaper price, but they also added one thing that made me beyond furious. So they removed the time of flight sensor, which just handles like depth control and all that crap for like photos, which is justified for a basic version, like a basic model. But here's the part that gets my goat. They added a headphone jack in the P30, but removed it for the P30 Pro.
Why?
Exactly. That drive me up the fucking wall. I was like, okay, if you added the headphone jack in the fucking Pro, then it would be more pro. Because if a pro was going to use, which by the way, I hate that they added pro in it, because no professional is going to use a smartphone as their primary camera unless they were doing like a social experiment. That's ridiculous. All right. That aside, like Huawei has officially overtaken, like the P30 series has officially overtaken the S series as my most hated smartphone lineup of all time.
Right. I kind of agree with you. I don't know much about Huawei. I'm someone who uses the Samsung, and I can kind of understand your hate for the S series. But my hate kind of stems from a different perspective. I think smartphones now are about as powerful as... They're more powerful than they need to be, essentially. So I think the role of a midline phone shouldn't be to remove features kind of like what Huawei did, which is strange because, like, they removed the headphone jack going up in price, not down in price. But that aside, really the point of a midline phone should kind of be to tone down the specs while maintaining the features, because I think, here it is, people are trying to keep their smartphones longer and longer with each successive generation, because not only are they more powerful and they take longer to, what I like to call, expire or like slow down to the point where it starts affecting your enjoyment of the phone. Because if you have a phone as powerful as they get now, it takes a lot longer for it to get so slow that you need to replace it. So I think the main kind of drive in terms of marketing is the features that they added, like with each successive generation. And the best example that I have with the S10 is the fact that you can charge the phone. Like, you can charge two phones just by touching each other. Like, you don't... That...
Oh my god.
Yeah, no.
Here we go again. Here we go.
Feature. And I remember I upgraded from the Note 5 to the Note 9, and the feature that most excited me wasn't the specs, because, like, here's the thing. You mentioned it yourself when you said that no professional is going to use their phone as their main workhorse. Really, the role of a phone isn't to be much of a workhorse unless you... I hear people talk about gaming phones, which, if you game on your phone, that's fine, but personally, I think if you're going to game hardcore, it's better to have a dedicated console, even if you want portability like the Switch, than to use your phone. But that in itself is a whole tangent.
Hey, Emil, remember when you were going to buy the Razer phone?
I just really liked the refresh rate on it and the fact that it had two front-facing speakers, which, again, is kind of what drives me to a phone now. What is its niche and what kind of features does it have? Because, like, when I'm trying to build my computer, the specs are the most important thing, because you can have the top of the line specs now, and if I want to run a game or if I'm going to do something intensive that requires like rendering, then the specs matter a lot. For what most people, and I want to say almost all people, do on their phone, I will be as bold as to say that the features and specs that we have on our phones now are beyond overkill, with the exception of some very small specific uses. I know Adobe released like the suite on like apps now, but like I find it weird that people would use that, because you can't get the same precision as a computer. So that's why I say, like, very niche audiences. What's going to get you to buy a new phone isn't what the phone has in it, it's about the features that it includes. So an OLED screen is really cool because the always on display helps you save battery, and the same with the OLED screen, but yeah. And a feature like having your phone be a portable wireless charger is something that's practically useful, and that's something that's going to appeal to most people who buy a phone because that's something you can use. And my problem with the S series is that it doesn't serve any particular niche. Like with the Note series, it's called the Note and it comes with an S Pen. It has a particular audience it wants to appeal to, aside from just being the flagship series that Samsung releases. The S series just kind of serves as a less attractive iPhone because Apple can, yeah.
So yeah, okay. So let me sorry to interrupt. So let me get into that. That's I like never really gave a concrete reason why I hate the S series. So let me be very clear. Holy shit, dude. I don't know what's wrong with me today. I cannot speak. Um the S series is kind of like a nicotine patch. So it's what I call like the iPhone
Oh,
recovery phone. It's like, yeah, so it's like, hey man, I've had an iPhone for the last 4 years. God, I'm so sick of all the restrictions. Apple's so greedy, blah blah blah. And I I want to switch to Android, but I don't know what's good. Oh wait, Samsung has made 50 billion ads roasting Apple, which by the way are amazing. I love that song. I'm a genius. Fucking love those ads. They're just hilarious. But Samsung has made a good image of being reverse Apple. Apple takes away features, we include them. Rah rah rah. Switch over to Samsung. And I didn't know it until I got my Samsung. And dude, I'm the prime example. I had an iPhone 6 for the last 4 or 5 years, and I finally switched to Android. And my very first like thought was, I need a Samsung phone. And let me explain. I'm a man who's very, very, very well familiar to like every phone manufacturer's like niche, and I'm gonna tell you why I chose a Note. I hate the S series because I'm not enough of a I don't know what you call it, like a I'm not enough of like a normal like non-phone geek to like just say, oh yeah, fuck it, like the S series is basically just the iPhone but for Android, because that's what it is. You know, it's like iPhones are cigarettes. The S series phones are just nicotine patches. If you buy an S series phone, you're buying like iPhone rehab, as far as I'm concerned. You're not actually like buying a really good phone that's best for you. You're just kind of rebelling against Apple. You're like, Apple, I have a headphone jack now. When in reality, people, if they just do like maybe like an hour of research, they'll be like, oh yeah, I'm probably not gonna like Samsung software. I'm never gonna use an SD card slot because, spoiler alert to anybody who's looking to buy an S8 or above, the S series going from the S8 and like the Note series from the eighth generation, they only accept SD cards that can read write in 4K. So if you have an SD card that like has a lower read write speed and it's not meant for 4K Ultra, then what you're getting is just a fucking storage device that cannot handle that kind of like capacity, and the phone just will not upload any pictures to it of that resolution. So like that's something I found out from Best Buy, and the cheapest one is actually from Samsung. They're about $50. It's actually
that's
brutal.
wild. Although I kind of disagree with your statement of they're the reverse Apple. I think of Samsung more as the Apple for Android users because they try to fulfill a lot of the same roles that Apple has, but with the Android market. And I think the reason that they have a one up on Apple is that they don't have the same ecosystem that Apple has, because Apple has a really great ecosystem, as I think Marcus Brownlee calls the walled garden, and that's something that they have the advantage with because everything is proprietary. But with Android, because it's Linux based, it's a lot harder for them to integrate everything, but they still try to fulfill that niche anyway. And the S10 is essentially, or just the S series in general, is the iPhone for Android users. It's supposed to be a premium, quote unquote, flagship phone that's high end, but not as high end as the Note, so it's kind of budget for most people. That's why I think the S series.
It literally starts at $1,000. It's competing with the iPhone directly, and that's kind of what Samsung's all about. I don't think Samsung's ever competed with like other phone manufacturers that aren't Apple. And I watched a great video on
No.
this. You know, Tech Alter. He explains like yeah, oh, he explains the business behind like tech
And I think I
rather
have
than
heard
like
of
the
him.
actual tech. So he meant so in this one video, it's called "Why Apple Doesn't Talk About Competitors." He explains that Apple will always lose a one-to-one race. So for example, if you look at Apple like an iPhone spec sheet, like just numbers alone versus like a Samsung, it's not even a comparison. Like why would you ever buy an iPhone? But what it doesn't show you is the software optimization, the ecosystem, the support, all the extra features that you get with buying like an Apple product, and it's kind of misleading. So Apple can never make that one-to-one comparison the same way Samsung does, because all Samsung has to do is just say, "Hey, we're better than Apple, like the most luxury phone brand out there." So we're also luxury, but we're more luxury. But Apple can never do the reverse because they have to stoop down to like compete. You know, it's like a weird. It's kind of like the curse that Apple's placed on themselves. They have to operate in a vacuum. You know what I mean? Like they always have to compete with themselves. I don't know if you've ever watched an Apple keynote. You should do it sometime. It's pretty amazing just to see like how they market themselves. So what Apple does for marketing, and I don't see a lot of YouTubers talking about it, but they essentially do it by making the celebrities, making the executive celebrities. So if you go on Tim Cook's Twitter, you'll see something like a couple million followers for the CEO of Apple, and like people know Tim Cook as like the CEO of Apple. He's become like famous for
Yeah,
it. You
but
know
I
what I mean?
think. Sorry.
So if I go on Tim Cook's Twitter right now, he has 11.2 million followers. That's insane. What Apple's done is essentially celebritized their executives. They've turned them into characters. They've turned their events into, you know, big like events. They're meant to shake up the entire tech industry, and usually that's what they do, but not in the way people like would assume. So it's not Apple like innovating. It's them dictating the next 5 years of what phones are going to look like, behave like, sound like, etc. The only exception to that is obviously Samsung. For example, iPhone 7 released, no headphone jack. You can count on three hands, like big company, three fingers, big companies that still have a headphone jack. And as of 2018, one of those is
Oh.
gone. It used to be OnePlus, Huawei, and Samsung. And Huawei's like they have that one foot out the door. OnePlus gave up on the headphone jack with the OnePlus 6T. Like Apple just dictates the rest of what like other manufacturers are going to do, except for Samsung. And as to the reason I chose a Samsung is because I'm fundamentally a hardware guy, right? I need to have a physical like copy of all my files, so I need an SD card slot. I need the option to have a headphone jack, even though I like never use it because I go completely wireless because I'm a lazy fuck and sometimes I forget to charge it. Wired headphones are pretty cool, but wired earphones are complete garbage. Don't at me. It's like the Google Pixel, right? The Google Pixel is a closer one-to-one sheet of what an iPhone is to Android. If you really break it down, Google is more like Apple than Samsung. It's a company that controls the OS vertically because the Android is fundamentally owned by Google. It just is, you know? It has its own ecosystem full of Google products, the Google speakers, Google Assistant, etc. It has no headphone jack, no removable battery. It has a great camera and image processing, but that's a whole other conversation. And it's just one of those things where it's infuriating that Samsung leverages themselves as like Apple's the anti-Apple, when in reality like people don't realize like Samsung is it. Like they're the last man standing. Like they're holding on to all the old relics because they know that if they like give in, lose the headphone jack, and give up what's something else Apple gave up? Holy shit! Like name something. Like let's use the headphone jack as an example for now, right? If they are like, all right, we're Samsung, we're removing the headphone jack altogether right now. It's gone. That's it. There's no other big flagship companies out there that produce it. So then people are gonna start looking. People don't want to give up their headphone jacks. I like. You ever notice that? Like, people do not
I mean,
want the
of
headphone jack
course
to
not,
go.
because the problem is that they're moving towards the future, but they still, at least from Samsung, I haven't bought the most recent iPhones. They come packaged with, wired headphones because they're cheap and easy to produce. But if you want to buy something
Mm-hmm.
wireless like the Apple AirPods, they cost over $100. And you can argue that, hey, if you have the money to throw down on a $1,000+ phone, you should have the money to throw down on a $100, headphone experience. That's nice in theory, but not everyone just kind of comes with that, and most people just buy a phone because they need one. And it's not like everyone buying these expensive phones has the budget for it. So a lot of people don't want it to go because they have they already have the existing technology, but that can get into a really long argument, because if it kind of goes into the history of how Apple removes their technology, like old technology. You mentioned the headphone jack and you wanted another example. There's a whole list of examples I can give, like with the USB Type A on the newest MacBooks, because they're making it slimmer and because USB Type C is the future.
Hmm.
Everyone is getting dongles just to be able to support their old technology. And even on the newest iPhones, I remember when the iPhone X came out, they included a dongle for the actual charging port where you can plug in headphones. And this goes back even further. Back when the early 2000s, when they had the colorful iMacs and MacBooks, they didn't have floppy disk drives, and that was insane for most people to think about because everything was on floppy disk storage. But Apple was like, no, CDs and DVDs are the future, and we refuse to even have a floppy disk drive at all in our computer, when most people just wanted the option for both. But if Apple listened and didn't try to push the future, then we, not to say we'd still be using floppy disk, but it would definitely be a much slower tradition. So Apple is super aggressive with their transition into the future, and that's kind of why people don't want to like accept a headphone, like a jackless future. It's it's a little more than just a floppy disk, because the floppy disk was just objectively inferior. Same with the USB Type C. It's just hard to transition because of the current infrastructure we have. With the headphone jack, I think that's the exception with pushing the future forward, because wireless headphones come with their own sets of problems that wired headphones don't have, including battery, latency, frequency, stuff like that. It's the same reason why wired mice haven't gone away, even though wireless mice and keyboards have been around for years now. I think like over a decade, and multiple decades even. It's because they still have their place. Not only does a wired mouse have a better latency, better response time, and just doesn't have to charge, it's just cheaper on top of all those benefits. And that goes with the same with headphones. And that's why most people don't want to give it up, on top of the fact that it's just a slow transition. And also, you've made a lot of points. A lot of it is hard to kind of tackle one at a time.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. Like, I get kind of my thoughts get kind of like scattered the more I think about it, because there's so many different ways to attack the issue. Where it's like, is it a marketing issue? Is it like progression of our like society where we're moving more and more towards Apple's like
Yes.
envisioned wireless future?
So
Like, there's so many different like
a
ways
big
to go
point,
about it,
sorry, a
and
big point
like
I really want to tackle that you mentioned earlier is Apple competing against themselves, and why in a one-to-one competition they would lose. I don't entirely agree with that statement, because it kind of, what's the word? It kind of throws away their entire marketing strategy and to the type of audience they're appealing to, because that would imply that specs are the end all be all. I kind of mentioned before how specs become less important as time goes on, and I get that it's also like, take two phones, same price, they're gonna have worse specs, Apple, but they offer not a lot, but they do offer other things on top of that. One of which, I'm just gonna get this out of the way, is branding. a lot of the people who use Apple also use Beats, and I know that's because Apple also has special deals on Beats, but they
They
own it,
own it.
but just the deals themselves. Fundamentally, they appeal to the same audience, and that's the audience who care about branding and image more than technical quality. And not to say that Apple doesn't have much quality, it's just a lot of their quality comes in the name and the build quality of the actual products themselves. You can't sit here and tell me that MacBooks and iPhones don't look gorgeous. They are stunning
They are
visually.
stunning.
And the other benefit is that they have a very nice ecosystem. If you were to whip out, if you had an iPhone and you had a MacBook Pro, you could whip out your MacBook Pro and you can check your messages from your computer. And that's something that I could be wrong. I've seen no other company do. And that's not something you can put on a spec sheet and say, look, yeah.
Yeah, that's the point I was making. I was trying to say the reason Apple doesn't do that is because hold on. I had to burp. The reason Apple doesn't do that is because numbers are kind of a passive, they're like a placebo effect basically, right? Like let's say Samsung made a presentation, like they obviously do it during, like in their own keynotes, but they'll have a picture of the iPhone with its own spec sheet, right? And they'll have a picture of like their own phone on like right next to it. So in a numbers game, Apple will always lose. For example, let's talk about something basic like RAM, right? The iPhone XS Max has 4 gigabytes of RAM. That's $1,100 phone, right? The S10, even the Note 9 or S9, right? That's like 6 gigabytes of RAM. And it may not seem crazy, but when you see something as drastic as 4 gigabytes on a current smartphone that's over $1,000, it has less RAM than one from like a year ago. Wait, that makes no sense. What the fuck, Apple? And then you get into like no expandable storage. Well, Apple wants to sell you on their own cloud storage. That's why there's no fucking SD card slot. There's like Apple's whole phone is designed to make it like so it's made to make you comfortable and bring you in. It's kind of like Google's doing the same shit. It's just it's Google, everybody uses Google, so it's not as like egregious, I guess, because people will use Google Drive or Google Photos, whatever. But with Apple, it seems shadier because they're Apple, and it's like there tech companies are not. There's no saint, you know what I mean? There's no good tech company, right? So you get into this weird like level of, oh yeah, then what do I buy? And I know I'm like going in 10 different directions right now. I'm like kind of tired. The main point I'm trying to make is at the end of the day, you're not gonna by buying a Samsung, you're not gonna stick it to Apple. They're fine, Like Tim Cook isn't like crying in his bed at night because you say fuck Apple, or like you harass a tech YouTuber for giving the iPhone a compliment and accuse them of being paid off by Apple, which by the way is my favorite thing ever.
I think you're really isolating part of your audience, really sticking it to them.
Yeah, it's just something that's always personally bugged me about the smartphone space is that there's no right answer, there's no saint. But yeah, I'm sorry. I'm like, dude, I'm like fading
Another
right
point
now.
you mentioned
Holy
earlier
shit.
was the comparison of Google being closer to Apple than Samsung. I think there's definitely some merit to that. I think Samsung and Google both kind of take different aspects from Apple and try to incorporate it in their own design. Like Samsung can't have the same verticality with Android that Google does because, Google owns Android, and so they can. Thankfully, they haven't done this, but they can optimize Android as much as they want to their own liking. And again, I love Linux. And one of the reasons why is because it's open source, meaning that Android can have a complete control over their own flavor of Android. So I guess you're right in the sense of that Android doesn't have verticality over Android itself, but they do have verticality over their own flavor of Android. And they recently released One UI, and after using it for a while, it doesn't try to copy Apple's style. like in terms of functionality, but visually you can argue that they are trying to do that kind of minimalist, simple, rounded design that Apple tries to do. Not to say that they're trying to rip it off, but they are definitely trying to take the audience that Apple has and say, well, we're the Android version of that. So I think both Google and Samsung kind of try to fulfill the role of Apple in their own respective market. But I think Google does a better job of it because they're more established. And I think you mentioned also the fact that Google can get away with not forcing you to use their proprietary stuff like Google Docs and Google Drive, but essentially they do have such a stranglehold over the market that you're a lot more comfortable with it. Essentially, they're more established and they don't necessarily force you the same way that Apple does. I think that's why it's more like uncomforting when Apple does it, because they completely market, like not market, but they completely build their products around the idea that they want you to use their services. And I don't blame them for that, especially with how, how I mentioned earlier, the fact that people are keeping around their products for longer. And they have to fill in that gap somehow because they still have to churn a profit. And the way they do that is by selling their services or other peripherals, which is why the, walled garden is so important. Because if they don't, then they're not making the same profit. Apple didn't get to the point where they are financially without doing what they've done, essentially isolating the market and forcing people to stay within their boundaries. And they can get away with making inferior products that aren't very future proof. You're not going to be able to use the iPhone 10 100 years from now the same way you could use a computer 100 years from now. Because if I wanted to take my computer right now, 100 years from now, it's not going to be able to run everything well. But if I update to the latest OS, it'll still run and do everything it needs to do. With the iPhone, it's not going to be very practical 100 years from now because it's missing a lot of the nice luxury features like expandable storage and headphone jacks, which is, who knows if it'll be outdated. It's just not very practical if you're not using Apple services.
So, hold on a sec. Wait, 100 years is a pretty generous amount of time.
It's not so much the specs. I mean more the practicality of it and the use of it.
Because smartphones are one of a kind, and the issue I'm wondering about is, so an iPhone from 10 years ago, like the first one, unusable, even 2 years after its release. Because obviously we've evolved way past that point, and hardware is now being taken more seriously, and doesn't your Note 5, isn't that made out of
that's the Note
leather?
3. I think it's a
something?
faux leather on the back.
Yeah, and now these phones are made out of Gorilla Glass, and they're coated in Gorilla Glass. They're made out of titanium and stuff. They're really built to last. The iPhone 10 from 2017 right now is a good $600 phone, and it can last you for another 3 years. And the only thing that's going to be shit is the internal performance, not even the exterior. The shell is going to be fine.
Oh, yeah, no, definitely.
And, it's hard to judge because the last 3 years of smartphones are really the test. They're going to be the test of time. We're going to see how durable glass is in the long term. When just stuff starts to naturally decay, all that stuff. And before we go on, I just want to say this whole thing started out as a podcast about technology, and we just ended up ranting about smartphones for
we can have
45
more of these
minutes.
In the future. This is the smartphone episode.
Obviously, it turned into one.
But I think since we're talking a lot about smartphones, I just kind of ask, since we're hitting the 50-minute mark at this point, what is kind of the big takeaway you want the audience to have because we've definitely jumped around a lot
we jumped a lot. I know. I apologize to anybody who is spamming us about how inconsistent we are and that we don't follow through on points. We're really tired. It's late. We'll definitely have a better part 2.
But yeah, we talked
soon
regarding so we've jumped around between what smartphone manufacturers should look forward to going into the future, to how companies kind of, you know, behave when trying to market their products. I'm curious, just as kind of the big takeaway, what do you think the smartphone market is going to be like going forward from here? Because if you look back at, you know, the past 12 years leading up to this point and how the next 12 years are going to look like in 2027, when it's been 20 years since the release of the first iPhone, what do you think the ecosystem is going to look like for smartphones, and what do you think smartphone companies are going to prioritize above all else?
So that's a very like there's a lot of parts to that question. Let's start with the smartphone market was getting stale the last 2 years, especially from 2016, more 2017 till right now. The reason, if you asked me this question in December, I would say, oh, it's going nowhere. We're just going to have the same phone every year, but refurbished. But as of like the announcement of the Galaxy Fold, we're getting to some new shit. Because that's the introduction of a whole other different type of smartphone. Folding smartphones are probably going to be the future. And I think two things will happen from them becoming commonplace. Like, they're going to overtake in like old conventional like slabs of glass smartphones. Because not only are they going to remove them, they're also going to remove tablets, because the whole premise of a folding smartphone is to go from smartphone, boom, to tablet once you open it up. And that's going to shift the market in a big way. And I think Samsung's going to make a killing alone just from selling these fucking panels to everybody, including Apple. Google's gonna really, 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 like, they're gonna grind for, like, in software. Like, there's already, like, Android Q is already in beta. Like, that's insane. Like, dude, my phone, my Note 8, doesn't even have Android Pie, which, by the way, I'm insanely salty about. You know what I'm gonna do right now on the podcast? I'm going to go in my settings right now and see if the update is there. If I guarantee you it's not going to be there. Software update.
Drum roll, please.
It's checking. Oh, dude. Okay, ready? Oh my God!
Did you get it?
Holy shit! What the? Yeah. On the podcast. Oh my God. Oh my. Dude, I'm gonna cry. Right. You imagine this was live? Holy shit. Dude, holy shit. Oh my God, dude. It's finally here. This was promised in late February, and here we are, April,
6th.
Whatever.
It was like 10 minutes to midnight, so let's just say April 7th.
Yeah. So, fucking finally One UI. You know, my first download is gonna be the fucking Google camera.
All right, but getting back to your point.
Yeah. Getting back to the question, while my phone updates, I'm gonna keep it on, just watch it update while I'm talking, because I've just been, like, dude, you know how bad I've wanted this fucking
I haven't
update.
heard the end of it.
I know, I've probably cumulatively talked about it for like 6 hours.
Yeah, in total, just over the course of the past couple months, it totals to like 2 Lord of the Ring movies.
Honestly. Ooh, so this is like a big moment for me. I'm gonna try to collect myself and be ready to speak right now. So the last thing, so ecosystems, right? Android Q is gonna come out, and the reason it's gonna be big is because it kind of rolls into that folding smartphone area where Google's main focus is continuity between folding screens. So that's gonna be big for software side. The one thing I don't know about, like the one thing I'm unsure about, is a couple things actually. Now that I think about it more, whether or not the headphone jack is gonna be around. Because if it's a bigger phone, surface area wise, they could theoretically fit in a headphone jack, but we'll have to wait and see. Because like it is Samsung that's still producing it, and I haven't heard any reports of the headphone jack. B, long-term durability, because it is a folding phone, right? The screen is folding. C, more than anything, we are going to see a less emphasized focus on smartphones after the first 3-4 years of hype around foldable smartphones, because then we're gonna get into like the phone companies themselves, the manufacturers are gonna shift their attention to other stuff. Like Apple's most recent event was around their new services. Apple, like they need to get into the services. So they announced Apple Arcade, Apple News Plus, um, Apple TV, like their subscription service. Like they want to get into subscriptions because they are seeing the decline in the entire market for smartphones. Like smartphones are really on the decline, but once we get into folding stuff, not immediately. Because I don't know if you know the price of the Galaxy Fold. It's like $1,800. It's expensive. It's for a Gen 1 Fold. It's
10 years from now we're gonna have $5,000 phones. Just you wait.
Bet. Dude, smartphones might be the reason
or they might go the way of the printers and they'll take a loss financially to sell software and services that'll make up for the difference. Yeah.
Probably, right? And there's also I don't think phone companies are going to abandon the good old glass rectangles we've come to know and love over the last couple of years. What I think is going to happen is they're going to get downscaled. So as the bigger companies pay more attention on foldable phones, they're going to rebrand their premium, like their current premium flagships as like their budget options. So the iPhone XS Max, not literally, but like the form factor of it will be like the next budget iPhone for the people who can't afford or just don't want a foldable iPhone when that eventually comes out. And then for the budget Android manufacturers like the Nokias and the Xiaomis and the budget and the Blues, they're going to see a major upgrade. They're going to be able to finally afford like OLED screens. I think by 2026, being really generous at the time, by 2026, I think LCD screens on smartphones will be obsolete.
I mean, they're starting to get obsolete now.
Mm-hmm. They're the only reason they're still there is on budget devices that can't afford OLEDs from like Samsung.
I mean, yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that.
You know what I'm thinking about? What are we gonna title this podcast?
Well, we'll find out in post. I think personally, I'm gonna take a step back and talk more about the bigger picture because there's no way to get into specifics 10 years from now. Although before I do, funny enough, when I first heard about the concept of foldable smartphones, my first thought was like flip phones from like 10, 20 years ago. That's the first thing I thought. I need to do more reading into that just to see what it's more about. But
there's gonna be I'm glad you brought that up. You know Motorola, the Motorola Razr from like 2006. Okay, so if you look it up on your phone or something, you're gonna see a picture of it. It was like before iPhones, they were the coolest phones to have, the Motorola flip phones, and they were the ones that were like multicolored. They had like a camera.
They had a
on the
camera
back.
on the back, dude. That's some high tech stuff.
Yeah, it's right? 2006, so it was. So Razr, like Motorola is actually rebranding the Razr, so they're kind of getting it out of retirement. And the concept for it, I'm gonna send you the concept renders. They're pretty amazing. So what Motorola is gonna do is they're gonna take an OLED screen, and they're gonna put it in a clamshell like flip phone form factor, but there's not gonna be any buttons on the inside. It's just gonna fold out into one big smartphone, like normal smartphone size screen.
I mean, hey, we'll talk about it more after the podcast. We're already hitting the 1 hour mark. Getting back to the bigger.
Oh yeah, this was supposed to be a micro
Getting back
podcast.
To the bigger picture, because it's impossible to predict. I mentioned before that I'm not too interested in the smartphone ecosphere, but I think it definitely has the most potential to be the most interesting, because if you look at any other technology, if you look at the television, it serves one fundamental purpose, and you're just essentially watching pictures on a screen. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the history of televisions from the 1950s to what they are now, all they've essentially done is gotten bigger, slimmer, and improved visual fidelity. And obviously there's other features they've included, but that's generally the big thing you're going to see immediately when you see how they've progressed. With traditional computers and laptops, there's been a bit more change, but a lot more change has happened on the software end than the hardware end, because fundamentally a computer will be your monitor, the parts that go into it, and then your mouse and keyboard and other peripherals. with the smartphone, your smartphone essentially functions as not just a supercomputer in your pocket, but it's everything. And it's essentially the Swiss Army knife that you keep around in your pocket for the modern day. And I think that they have the most potential for excitement because the technology that goes into a smartphone is reflective of what most people use it for today. And I think going into the future, if tech companies continue to revolutionize things more on the hardware side of things and introduce features that are useful and that most people are going to utilize, like the wireless charging on smartphones. It seems like a small thing, but it's definitely an example of what I mean by it's a cool feature that most people can get use out of, and it makes the smartphone more of a Swiss Army knife that can be used for everything. So 10 years down the line, what I hope to see is, companies looking at what people need or looking at a potential problem that people don't even know about and attempting to solve it with smartphones, which, that's how technological advancement works. And also, I'm hoping that because my prediction is that they're going to do what I stated earlier. They're going to have these really bulky, over-expensive phones with too many features, and some useful, some not. And they're going to try to cut down on the cost so they can make up for it with subscription services. That's 100% what I believe is going to be the future 10 years from now. But I'm hoping instead they slim down a bit and focus on what's important. Maybe budget phones will do that, but I'm hoping that even with flagship phones, they don't get too carried away. They advance technologically to include what people need, and they remove features that people don't. I know I've ragged a lot on how headphone jacks are becoming obsolete, but if we do ever reach a point where wireless headphones are affordable and the battery life is long enough where most people want to use it, then I think that will be the best time to remove the headphone jack to help cut down on cost. Because what I want to see from smartphones moving forward is the Swiss Army knife that people want to use and that will excite us technologically, like with the folding smartphones.
See, I'm glad you brought up the headphones because it kind of raises the question of AirPods. You remember when AirPods were released, everybody gave Apple shit for it? Well, here we are 2-3 years later, and I think I read somewhere that as of 2019, AirPods have officially become the highest selling wireless headphones of all time. I mean,
I'm not surprised. They really are great. I hate the way they look, but I think I was one of the few people that loved the concept when it came out. I didn't like it because of the price and because Apple, but I think wireless headphones are the future. But yeah, getting to the main message. I think smartphones have a lot of potential. I really do. And to see that potential get squandered by companies who want to either overbulk their phones or kind of want to sell a service would kind of be a disappointment. And I think that's it. We're already at like an hour and 5 minutes, so
Mm-hmm. So I think this is a good time to do our outro because we could honestly talk about this forever.
Oh my God. This is supposed to be a mini podcast, and we're already over an hour in, and there's still so much I'd love to talk about, and I'm sure you would too. Yeah,
I know, dude. Same here. And like, we didn't even scratch like the surface of like, we didn't even go to computers, like more smartphones, because like we didn't talk about a lot of other stuff like internal components and stuff like that. But we didn't even get into peripherals.
But hey, if you want to hear more of our general ramblings and opinions on just everything to do with tech and smartphones, please let us know in the comments if you've stuck around this far.
Mm-hmm. And please hit that subscribe button. And if you want to do me a double-decker solid, I don't know why I called it that, please feel free to hit the notification bell as well, just to really commit.
I'm looking forward to more of these podcasts.
Dude, so am I. Speaking of, I have a very special announcement to make. Pop Culture Everything is officially on Twitter, Instagram, And are you ready? We officially have our
Woo!
own Discord. So if you want, if you want to join our Discord, you could chat with us, give us video suggestions on what you would want us to talk about. Yeah, shit posts. And hey, so like if there's enough of you, maybe one day we'll like pick somebody random to just do a podcast with. So yeah, like all links to everything I just mentioned in the description down below, and join us in a couple days. I was gonna say next week, but I'm like
next time.
That makes no sense.
What are we gonna talk about? The same week.
Join us next time when we do our second interview ever, and we're gonna keep the guest a surprise. But for those of you that like gaming and Twitch, please don't miss episode 4 of Pop Culture Everything. But for now, I've been your host, Creams.
Emil.
He doesn't have a cool nickname yet. We're working on it.
We'll see you next time.
And we're out.